Hello there, I'm Jimmy Vegas and welcome to a game development tutorial series designed for those who want to learn Unity. We'll be learning how you can make your own game in Unity 6 for free just by following along with me. Who is this tutorial series designed for? It's designed for beginners and newcomers to the game development world, as well as intermediate developers in other engines such as Unreal or Godot. I will take you from a beginner level to an intermediate level by the end of the series, and I will teach you everything you need to know along the way. No experience in design? No problem, we'll learn that. No idea how to start with programming? Not a problem, we'll learn that from scratch. We'll be using Unity 6 in these tutorials, but you can theoretically use any version of Unity from version 5 onwards. Some things may be labelled slightly differently, but this tutorial series is built to be future-proof as well as legacy-proof. Let's get started. So in this first tutorial, we will explore how to get Unity on your PC, we'll explore the hub, we'll get acquainted with the engine interface, and we'll start actually building our game. Where do we get Unity? Where do we go? How do we get it? Easy, unity.com. As soon as you go there, you'll see a big button in the middle saying download. If not, you can click on products and click on Unity Engine. Both of these will take you to the exact same place, which is this area right here. What is this? This is the download page that will download the Unity Hub, not the Unity Engine, but we will get into that. There are two separate products that we have to use. One is called the Unity Hub and the other is called the Unity Engine or the Unity Interface. We need to download the Hub initially so we can then install the Unity Engine. And to do that you can download for Windows, Mac or Linux, and it's as simple as clicking download. My download has started, so as soon as it's done that, you just need to install the Hub and then we can carry on. This is the Unity Hub. And the Unity Hub, as mentioned, is a separate product from the Unity editor, but this allows us to see where all of our projects are. So every project that we create or want to work on is listed here in the Projects tab of the Unity Hub. And you can see the list of everything that I'm currently working on. If we go here to Installs, this is where we can easily install the Unity editor or Unity Engine. You can see currently I have two versions installed, and that is version 6 and version 2022.3. How do we get a version on here? Well, we click up here on Install Editor. When it does that, it will give us a couple of different options. We have official releases, pre-releases, and archive. An archive is the older versions of Unity that you can't quite simply just download from the hub. You need to go to the download archive and get them that way. These are the older versions of Unity that may not necessarily be supported anymore. Pre-releases are versions of Unity which are still in the works. Think of them as new versions being created by Unity Technologies for better features in the future. You could use these if you wanted to, but I wouldn't recommend using anything from the alpha or beta program. I would stick with the official releases. These are the ones with LTS or long-term support, so if there is an issue or any problems, they are updated more often than some of the older versions. So this series is aimed in Unity 6. You could use it in 2022 or 2021 or any other versions if you wanted to. So what you would do is find the version you want to use, in this case version 6, and click on Install. This will then give you plenty of options for you to install for Unity. Now, this may take a while to install because it is quite large, but we need to have some fundamental things in place depending on what we want to develop here. We need to make sure that we have Microsoft Visual Studio. That's all good. So we need to make sure that we have the supported platform. So if we want to build for Android, iOS, Windows, whatever, you can select it here. Remember, you can build in Unity, so things like Nintendo Switch, things like Sony PlayStation, Microsoft Xbox. However, you will require a license for those. I will explain a little bit more later on. For now, make sure you have selected at least one of these modules that you want to build for. In my case, it will be Windows, so that's fine. And then you will click on Continue. And this will then install the whole editor, and it may take a little bit of time, so maybe go and get yourself a cup of coffee, cup of tea, snack, something while it all installs. Now, when it is done, we would then head back to projects, and this is where we create a new project. So much like I have all of these here, we will click on New Project and make sure you select the correct version up here. So if you want to build for Unity 6, you would select it here. I have a couple of different versions here, which is why I'm able to select. When we have our version selected, let's click on Universal 3D. You can build for 2D if you wanted to, but there is also something called the High Definition 3D. Now, let me explain what these are. This is the Universal Render Pipeline. This is the High Definition Render Pipeline. Now, just to be clear, these are different. If you create something in the High Definition Render Pipeline, something for the Universal Render Pipeline may not work, and vice versa. I will say the words post-processing now. You may not know what post-processing is, it's irrelevant, but these two are different and work differently depending on the pipelines. Now, what we're doing here, for beginners, because we're learning, we need to make sure that we are on the Universal 3D one. This is the Universal Render Pipeline. Over here, we set our project name. So this can be anything at all. My first game, my first project, Super Gravity, something or other. I don't know, whatever you want to name your game. Select the location right here. And if you're offline like me right now, you don't need to select an organization. However, if you are online, you would just select your account from this drop-down list, and then you would click on Create Project. And what that will do is it will take a couple of minutes to build the default template for a brand new project. This is the Unity editor or the Unity engine. This may look similar to other engines that you may or may not have used. However, there are things in here that we probably need to discuss, especially for beginners. So let's get into what a lot of these things on our screen right now actually mean. Here on the left, we have something known as the hierarchy. And the hierarchy is a place where you can store all of your game objects in a simple text list form. What are game objects? They are everything here in the scene view. And the scene view is where we build our game with all of our game objects. A lot of what we do is very visual when it comes to developing in Unity. A game object can be absolutely anything from a camera, a light, a model. It can be anything at all. However, that's not necessarily true for assets. And that is what is down here in the project window. An asset is literally anything that you import into Unity, whether it is a texture, a script, a scene, or an audio file. That is known as an asset, but they don't necessarily reflect here in the scene view. Think of it as scene view is game objects, project window down here is the assets that go onto those game objects. So in this case, we have a main camera. And over here in the inspector panel, we can see that it has something known as components. And everything by default that you select in the hierarchy will have a transform component at the bare minimum. What is a transform component? It is a way of positioning, rotating, and sizing any game object in the scene view. For example, we have the camera selected here. And we can see the camera here in the scene view, but we can't quite focus on it properly. So let's take this hand view here, the view tool, and let's hold the left mouse button and move around our scene. And then let's use our middle mouse wheel to zoom in. And we can move around a little bit more and get closer to where the camera actually is. However, we could then change the position over here. We could say we want the position on the X to be 50. And it would disappear. If we hold Control and press Z, we can put it back to where it was. Back here in the scene view, you can select this move tool, and you can do the same thing by dragging the arrows here. So the red is the X, the green is the Y, and the blue is the Z. And you can move them on any axis because this is a 3D environment. Remember, hold Control, press Z to undo any changes if you aren't happy. These three windows, the hierarchy, the scene, and the inspector panel, All of these three you will use simultaneously on many different occasions when creating a game. To give you a further example, if we put in a game object, we need to move it around in hierarchy, perhaps put it inside another game object, manipulate it here in the scene view, and then maybe change its position and rotation, as well as some other things here in different components. Speaking of components, every object, aside from the transform, may have other components, and this could be absolutely anything at all. This could be a camera component, like this one here. And if we go on directional light, you have a light component. If you have perhaps an object with a character model in, it would have the character model as a component and the controller as a component. You can add scripts as components. Almost any script could be a component on any game object. What is this window here? Game. This game view is a way of playing anything you've created in Unity real time. You don't need to build a project. You could just create something in the scene view, a couple of objects, a player. You want to make sure everything works okay. You would just press this play button up here. It would then switch to the game view and you'll be able to physically play your game in the engine itself without the need to build an executable. And coming back to something like the main camera, as I mentioned about components, scrolling down here, you can add different components by clicking this button, depending on what it does. Not every game object requires certain components. A good example of that is collision components. If you've got a wall, perhaps, you don't need a camera to have that collision component on there because it doesn't need to be on there. A wall would need to have it on there. Same the other way around. A wall would not need to have a camera component on there. You would simply drag and drop a camera onto the wall rather than have a camera component on the wall. If that may seem confusing, don't worry, we'll explain all things like that a little later on. The next tab along is the Animator tab, and this tab is designed mainly for managing your animations. So let's say you've got a 3D character and they either run or stand still. You will be able to manipulate the animations in here to kind of seamlessly blend them together or just differentiate between the two. You may not currently have this tab, and if you don't, that's fine. You'll be able to add it. These three dots up here, if you click it, go to Add tab, and you can select down here things like the Scene View, Game View, Inspector, Hierarchy, Project, Profiler, and Animation. Not all tabs are easily selectable like this. However, again, if you don't have this tab, it's not important right now, but you could always go to Window and you could add it down here, right there. So all these tabs in the windows can be accessible by adding them through here, which is perfectly fine. So let's click back on the scene view. And down here in project window where all the assets are, remember when I spoke about scenes being assets? Well, this current scene that we're in is actually an asset. And you can think of a scene asset as a folder that contains all of the other assets. And you created all of them assets together. And that's very, very useful because all of those scenes put together create the game. Next is the console tab, and this console tab is a way of telling you where there's a problem in your game. For example, we've written a script and something is wrong in the script. Here in the console tab, it will tell you that the game cannot be compiled because of a particular line in a particular script. And if you follow the instructions that the console gives you, you'll be able to establish where that error is and you'll be able to fix it. The next tab along is the Animation tab. And once again, you may not have this tab, but you can add it here by going Add tab, Animation, or going to Window at the top. And the Animation tab is a way of creating cool, quick, easy, simple animations to use inside Unity. And a good example of this is a fading screen. So you have a completely black screen, you want to fade into your game, you could theoretically create a nice, quick and simple animation that will allow you to fade into your game. So heading back to the project view, also worth noting that all of these tabs do not necessarily have to stay in their current position. For example, you could move the inspector panel if you wanted to, you could move the game view if you wanted to, you could drag it out to there and make it its own independent object, make it not quite full screen, but big enough for you to actually play test. You can then add it back in, or if you wanted to, you could have the animator tab as a separate object coupled right there. You could move the inspector panel over here to where the hierarchy is and move the hierarchy over there. I think it's all about how you want your engine to look, how comfortable you feel with things in the places they are. I'm going to stick with the default layout because most people feel quite accustomed to how the default layout is. The next thing that we need to get kind of accustomed to is the build profiles. And if we go to File and Build Profiles, it opens a small window, and this basically tells us what platform we're currently building for, what we can build for, as well as what scenes are involved in our game. So right now I have Windows as the active build platform. That means that if I were to build this game, it would be a Windows executable. If perhaps we wanted to build for Android, we would select Android and click on Switch Platform. It's worth noting that any project that you create in Unity can be built and ported to any supported platform. So you could start with Windows, you could build your game, you could create it, you could release it, but then think you want to create an Android version. So add a little bit of code in there, add in the mobile controls, and you would select Android and switch platform and build for Android. It really is as simple as that. It's worth noting that you can switch platform at any point during development. However, it may take longer to switch platform the larger that your project is. For now, I'm going to stick with Windows, and I need to take a look in my scene list. So remember when I spoke about scenes, I've spoken multiple times about these. The scene is like a folder of different objects together. You could think of it as like a level. Well, this is where we're able to tell the game what scenes should be involved with our game. At the moment, we have one single scene, which is sample scene, which is this scene that we are in right now. By default, that is the single scene that we get. And we need to keep that as it is. So make sure you have your settings all set here. You have that scene in there, and you have whatever platform you're building to ready to go. And at this point, we've got all the basics of the Unity editor down and sorted. We have everything ready to go. We just need to actually start building our game. And how do we do that? Well, games are built using game objects, and the fundamental game object that anybody can use when it comes to beginning game development is a cube. A cube is the core of all game development because they can be used for many different things. But how do we get game objects into a game to start creating something? Well, that's actually very, very simple. Let's go to Game Object. Let's go to 3D Object and click on Cube. And what that will do is it will generate a cube literally in our scene. And this is now its own game object, and we can do many different things with this cube. First thing we'll want to do is give it a name. So by default it is called cube, but we'll call this ground. And this ground cube needs to be a bit bigger. It's not quite in the right place, and it's definitely not the right shape. So let's take this opportunity to use the transform component. Firstly, let's set the position to 0, 0, and 0. And it's disappeared from my view, which is perfect, because what it means is that I can double click on this object in the hierarchy and it will move to it in the scene view. Now I can use my mouse wheel and scroll outwards. I can hold the mouse wheel down and I can pan up, and then I can hold the right mouse button down and I can look down at the cube. So we need to make this more of a ground object, and I'm going to set the scale on the X and the Z to 8 and 8, and I'm going to keep the Y as 1. Now this does not really look too much like a ground, but for all intents and purposes it will be a ground. There are many other game objects that we can add as a fundamental base to game building as well. And if we go to Game Object, we can go to 3D Object again, and you can see here, although we selected cube, you can see that we could have selected a sphere, capsule, cylinder, plane, and quad. Now, a lot of these aren't really relevant when it comes to designing a game for basic purposes. Things like a plane aren't massively important, a cylinder not necessarily, but a capsule, sphere, and cube I would say are the three core elements of game objects in Unity game development. good example of that is we could add another cube, and that is its own separate object again. So let's go 0, 0, 0 on the position. Let's hold Control and let's drag the green arrow upwards. And what that's done is moved it by one whole single place. Now what we could have done is hold the left mouse button on the green arrow and move it, and you'll see it moves it in much smaller increments. However, this way is much harder to snap and align game objects together. You could theoretically do it, but it would take much longer. So that is why we have the snap settings able, if you hold Control, to just move things in whole chunks like so. So it moves it and snaps it to the exact position. Now if I were to click anywhere in the scene, not on a game object, move things around, zoom in, you can see how that is now perfectly placed on top of that object. And you could use this cube as something for perhaps a spinning coin. A lot of the time you can imagine cubes as placeholders for game objects. So this will eventually be something, we're just using it as a placeholder for now. Much like we're using this as the ground, it's a placeholder just for now. I found a lot of times beginners tend to like building things with cubes first because it gives them a good sense of how game development and building a level actually works. But right now, this looks very, very plain. Yeah, it looks kind of cool because there's a little bit of shadow there and the lighting is kind of nice, but we need a little bit more to it than just being grey. Textures and materials are crucial in game development. You could imagine that a texture being applied to a game model is normal. However, that is not the case when it comes to development. A texture is actually applied to a material, and a material is then applied to a model or game object. The reason being is because applying a texture to the material means that we can modify that material to make it however we would want it to be, give it different graphical elements. So what we're going to do is we're going to import some textures now, and we're going to place them on some game objects to see what they look like and how we can manipulate them using materials. In order to do that, we need to go to our assets here in the project window, right click, create, and click on folder. Let's name this folder textures. And inside this folder, I'm going to now drag and drop 3 textures. I'm going to take these 3 textures right here. And if you go to the pinned comment, you can go and download these textures for free. Just make sure that you unzip them before you try importing them into Unity, as you cannot import things into Unity from a zipped file. Now remember earlier when I said that applying a texture to a material and then to an actual game object is how it's done? Well, I'm just going to drag and drop this texture onto this game object. And at first glance, it looks like I've literally dragged and dropped this texture onto this game object, and I was lying before, but that isn't the case. You'll notice that a folder has appeared called materials. And what's happened here is when we've dragged this material and placed it on this game object, it's automatically created that material and placed it on the game object for us. So if we click on the the ground now, you'll notice that here we actually have a material component, not the texture. So if we click on the material of Stone 001, you'll see we have a couple of different options here. I'm not going to go into everything right now because for beginner and initial development purposes, there's no point trying to understand a lot of the differences between the surface options and surface inputs, but there are some key things that we do need to take a look at. And before we do that, we actually need to create something called a normal map. And a normal map is a way of making things look a bit more realistic or a bit more 3D, because they use lighting and shadows a tad more than just having a flat 2D surface. Because right now, if I zoom in, the face of this game object is very stretched and very blurred, because what's happened is that we have literally applied one image of this texture onto the material and onto here. So this face of the game object is quite literally just that material, that texture, excuse me. So what we need to do is manipulate everything now to make this look a little better. And to do that, we can take this stone texture, hold Control and press D. And what we've done is a keyboard shortcut to duplicate anything. So whether it is a texture, whether it's a script, whether it is a game object in the hierarchy, we can use Control D to make a copy of it. And what we'll do is we will rename this to stone001 underscore n. And that n is just a little tag for normal map. So we then need to go over here in the inspector panel, make sure we have the normal map version selected, and change the texture type to normal map. Then click on Create from Grayscale and click on Apply. Now I know I've skipped over a lot of options here. The reason being is because for what we're doing, a lot of it is irrelevant. However, as a quick TLDR, these will allow you to change different properties of this particular normal map. For example, its bumpiness, and it will give you the option to make it look a little different on your material. But for now, we just need to make sure that we have this normal map so we can make this material look a little different. So if we go to our materials folder and click on Stone001, there are two ways that we can now apply that normal map to this material. We can either select the little button here and select it here, or we can make sure that we do still have the material selected. We can go to textures and then we can drag and drop onto the square next to normal map. And instantly you'll see that this game object now does look a little different. It looks a little bit kind of more pixely, but it definitely seems to react a bit more to the light and the shadows and gives it a bit more of a 3D look. What we need to work with now is how it physically looks. And what I mean by that is changing things like the metallic map, the smoothness, the source, the normal map, as well as the tiling. All those options put together, although there are many more, those options that I've just mentioned are the key ones to making this look like a better object. Let's start with the metallic map. And if we scroll that from 0 all the way to 1, you can see how more shiny this becomes. This kind of visible material is going to be much more useful in perhaps a rainy environment. It's not currently raining our environment, so we don't quite need it so high. The smoothness, if I change it, you can see it becomes much smoother. And if I change it to about there, you can see once again, the higher it is, it becomes much more relevant to this metallic one. And this now gives it a kind of a nighttime feel. So just these two elements here changing, if I hold Control, press Z twice to undo, just those two elements can give a completely different feel to a material. The source, if we change it to albedo, this is not strictly necessary in a lot of terms, but if you want to change how your material looks, try changing this source. It might give you a better look. Next thing, let's change our normal map. Now, obviously, the higher this number is, the more in-depth it's going to be, the more persistent it's going to be, the more intense it's going to be. The lower it is to 0, the flatter it's going to be. And you can go inverse on this. So you could say -1 as opposed to 1. And you can see how that looks. A lot of textures may not necessarily be affected by how it looks, but you could imagine something being indented and I forgot what the opposite of indented is, but that's how you can use normal maps to kind of bring that out and make it pop. Last thing to do is change the tiling. And as I said, this is currently one big texture on a single face of a game object. To change this, we could say 2 by 2. And what that means is that there's now 4 instances of this one texture on this one face. So we've got one here, one here, one here, and one here. It's seamless, so it looks great. So it kind of doesn't just have a jagged end and stop. So using seamless textures when it comes to something like grass, stone, dirt, anything like that is a sensible idea. I'm going to set the tiling as 4 by 4, which means that this texture is now multiplied 4 times down this way, 4 times down this way. So we have 16 versions of this texture on here. And if I go to game view, although we can't really see it very well, we'll change that in just a moment. We could then kind of zoom out a little bit and change the normal map. So let's change this normal map to 0.5. And let's change the metallic up a bit, smoothness down a bit. And you could also change the base map color. And what I mean by that is if we select it red, you can see it turns it red. If you select white, it turns it its normal color. If we change it to green there on the wheel, it goes green. If you change it to black, it gives it a very, very dark feeling. So once again, you can use these options to give you different emotions via materials, and it's very, very handy. But if I zoom in now, it does look a little bit better than what it is. Don't worry about things looking too blurry at this point. It's not too important because a lot of this changes during the course of development anyway. So if I zoom out a little bit, I remember when we held Control and pressed D earlier on when we duplicated this normal map. Well, we can do that with this particular object as well. If we zoom out a little bit, hold Control, press D, still holding Control, we can then move this and snap it into position there. And in the game view, you can see things are starting to look a little bit more like a game rather than some big empty space. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention about materials is that we could do different things with materials when creating them. I dragged and dropped a texture onto this game object and it created the material for us. But we don't necessarily have to do that. We could create it from scratch. We could right click, create, material, and we'll call this dirt. And if we go to our textures, we can drag and drop this dirt texture onto there. And the great thing about materials is that whenever you change them after you've applied them to a game object, you can see the change in real time. If I zoom in, go to materials and drag and drop this material onto here, you can see that's how it looks. And you saw earlier when we changed the tiling to 4x4, it changed it real time here. And do I need to attach a normal map to this? Well, I don't know. It does look kind of cool, doesn't it? But attaching a normal map is entirely down to you. And manipulating different aspects of that normal map is also important. So if we go to dirt over here in textures, hold Control and press D to duplicate like we've done previously. Let's also rename. And then let's change the texture type to normal map, but let's not click on create from grayscale. And let's just click on apply. You'll see that it does look slightly different in its appearance down here. And if we go to materials, go to stone, and let's go to dirt, not stone. And let's click on the little button next to normal map and select dirt. And you can see just how much of a difference that this normal map is having on the game object. So what it all comes back to is how you want your materials to look, because there are infinite ways of manipulating a material to allow you to have the desired effect in terms of visuals. And what I would recommend is, if you're at this point, you've got the same textures as me, play around with these materials and explore them a bit more, see how they look. Last thing I want to do is just kind of move this camera around a bit. I mentioned earlier that the camera is a game object, but I didn't specifically mention why we have it, why we use it. Well, it's a way of actually whatever the game view sees. And you can see right now, if we look at this camera, if we drag it up, the game view has changed what it's looking at. So that's important to realize that whatever the camera sees is actually the game view itself. And if we're happy with this scene right now, we can go File and let's save. And we've just saved our sample scene. And it's important to make sure you save all the time, just like anything when working with computers. Saving is always important. And at this point, I think we are well on our way to actually creating a really, really cool game. So next time, what we're going to cover is we're going to cover terrains. Now, a terrain is, much like we have here, a way of creating a ground, but it's much more versatile and it is more like creating an actual world. Terrains are very, very in-depth and they're not particularly beginner friendly, but because this is a beginner series, I am going to make it very, very beginner friendly for you. So please remember to subscribe and click the notification bell to stay up to date with every tutorial. And I'll see you next time.